Well, good morning. Here's I'm doing excuse me. So this video is about the William Dahl reading of Keeping Knowledge Alive. Um, Before I share my screen, give you a little bit of background. Bill Dahl was my major professor at LSU. And he had clearly a profound influence on my understanding of curriculum. And so I think this article, although it originated as a talk, but later has been published, gives you a good sense of his ideas about curriculum, and we'll go through some of that. Dr. Dahl, he passed away about 3 years ago, and we maintain a close personal relationship. I am one of the few of his students that remained in Louisiana. Living in Baton Rouge, I was able to visit with him at LSU often, continued to attend some of his seminars on occasion. He openly invited his students back, which was a very interesting experience. Learned a lot. And when he finally did retire, he moved to Canada, Victoria, British Columbia. So it's on Vancouver Island. And that's where he passed away. He married a woman from up there who was a student of his. He would go up there in the summers and teach curriculum at the University of Victoria. He met this older woman who's a nurse, taking courses in to be a teaching nurse. Her name was Donna, or is Donna. And so settled, they moved to her family's farm, basically. Cared for her mother for a while, and it kept Bill active at the University of Victoria. He would come to Louisiana every now and then. We would see each other at conferences. The last time being at Ottawa at the International Curriculum Conference, Ottawa, Canada, in May of 2015. So that's 6 years ago now. It's hard to imagine that was the last time I saw him. He died at Christmas, I want to say 2018. And I talked with him about a week and a half or so before he died. Gives you a little bit of background. So let me go ahead and share the screen and get started. I think this is correct. All right, yeah. And I will scroll my notes. They're not really, they're notes, they're not an outline. There's a lot to talk about here. This is to keep me on track. Hopefully I've already gone a bit in my intro, so hopefully I can get this done in about 20 minutes or so. So I'll start with this opening paragraph, is that in the current era that we find ourselves in which teachers are asked to teach basically to the test, some high stakes test, and in which they are handed, more often than not, a prescribed curriculum or a scripted lesson plan, even more so now. keeping knowledge alive has become a greater challenge um, than before. And I think it's incumbent upon teachers, as you gain experience in the classroom, to find ways to um, insert activities in your lessons um, in which knowledge is becomes lively, helps students make it their own. So the key focus of this course of 503 is an attempt to show you as teachers how to do this, how to keep knowledge alive, and how you can generate your own repertoire, if you will, of practices that you can insert in any given lesson to do this. And this is part of the point of the final curriculum project, in which you do an analysis. And we'll talk, obviously there'll be a video on this. You may have already watched it, although I haven't, as of this recording, I haven't done it yet, so put it together. So in which you can analyze some standards and we go through a process of analysis, and then we call that unpacking the curriculum, and then you can repack it based on the findings through your analysis of what you as the teacher and what students need to make this lesson a good lesson, an effective lesson, and to keep the knowledge alive. So Dahl and curriculum. So Dahl's life's work in curriculum theory, which he came to later rather than earlier, is about moving teachers off the proverbial racetrack. So remember from Harvey, we talked about curriculum as the Latin term for a shortcut, a short racetrack, a shortcut. And Dahl largely did this by using the concept of play. And while play is often reserved for younger grades, he saw play as something that we as teachers can engage in. And I recognize this largely as language play. Playing, and we'll get into this, playing with the concepts, the curriculum concepts that you're trying to teach. Okay. He draws his notion of play from John Dewey. And so Dahl's rejection of use of play is a rejection of the culum suffix of curriculum. It's also a rejection of Ramos's methodical shortcut. So Dahl would say there's no quick way to learning. You have to immerse yourself into the curriculum, immerse yourself into the ideas and the concepts, into the skills, to engage in different types of knowing. So not all knowing is derived from learning. Particularly if you define learning as change over time. Okay, much of what we know we acquire. It's a different way to think about it. We acquire knowledge through our everyday experiences, and Dahl wants to utilize that process as much as possible. so that, learning is more related to the way we train animals. And again, this is also something Dahl draws from Dewey, and we'll get into that a little bit. You saw a little bit of that in the Harvey article. So Dahl's critique of method really begins with Whitehead. So we're going to talk a good bit about Whitehead. A little more so. So in the Harvey piece, I talked about Whitehead's rhythm of education. Dahl talks about this as well. But I'm going to go also into another article that Whitehead wrote called The Aims of Education. So you're getting the aims indirectly here. So Whitehead is really writing in opposition to the testing culture that largely still exists in British universities. And I'm not really sure how much it has changed. Whitehead says, do not teach too many subjects, but when you do teach thoroughly. Let the main ideas be few and important. And my aside is you can think of the standards largely as the main ideas. And if you look through the Louisiana standards particularly, you can argue for any particular content, be this at no matter what grade level, okay, that there really are too many standards. And there's a lot of redundancy in the standards if you know how to think about it. And if you begin to analyze these standards, okay. The key, I would argue, and I think this is implied in Whitehead and certainly implied in Dahl, is that you need to show as teachers how these main ideas are connected. They're interrelated in many different ways. And this is really, I think, an important aspect of teaching. And when you do your curriculum project, this is when you repack the curriculum, you really need to think in terms of how is all this interrelated? And this is the importance, and I would argue particularly for the later grades, so for middle school and high school, you have to integrate, you have to show the connections across curriculum so that you're not teaching every subject in isolation. So the student can see the connections and how to connect that in applying this knowledge in everyday life, okay? So along with that, Whitehead says, let the ideas be thrown together in every combination possible. This is really Dahl's concept of play or language play. Because by and large, what we're dealing with here is language, okay? The language of the subject areas, be it science or whatever science, be it math or whichever math, be it English, language, arts, be it social studies, history, geography, and it's government, civics. When I think in terms of history or I think in terms of geography, I'm always thinking about the other. You cannot teach history without teaching geography, and you cannot teach geography without teaching history. The same with civics. You would throw into that economics, okay? How the world works economically, politically, socially, and how geography bears upon that, um, and how our past bears upon that. So throw these things into combinations. The same is true in literary genres, okay? They are historical. They take place in a particular time and place, and they're given life. They have a life for a while, and then they wane, and something takes its place, okay? You know, we don't usually think of something like science fiction, a genre of science fiction, as being historically situated, but it is. Um, and you know, Frankenstein, the movie Frankenstein was on Turner Classic Movies the other night. You know, Mary Shelley's famous work. And of course, she wrote that, you know, in the mountains during a cold summer in the midst of the Little Ice Age that occurred in, you know, the mid 19th century. So it was a dark time, and so she writes this this novel. Well, it didn't start out as a novel. It was started out as a kind of playful exercise, and so you can see the play and social commentary all through that piece of science fiction, but it's situated in a particular time and place. Okay. Whitehead argues, and Dahl is really attracted to this notion, that the aimless accumulation of precise knowledge, or what we might call training alone, or precision of knowledge imposed too early, is self-defeating in getting students to acquire knowledge that they are able to make useful. So this is a training versus education concept. And this again is drawn largely from Dewey. And my guess is Whitehead would have been familiar with Dewey's work, even in England, where he's writing these essays. Whitehead does come to the U.S., becomes a Harvard professor actually in theology and cosmology. But at this time he's writing this, he's really a mathematics professor at Cambridge. Training is what we do with animals. Education is what we do with human beings. Okay. And I think that's because education, in order for it to truly educate, right, has to be transcendent. Allows a human being to transcend their current situation. Training merely gives you a skill without the full understanding of why that skill is necessary. And so I think particularly in the earlier grades, this is a constant struggle because we need to teach students certain skills in order for them to become educated. So the idea is when do we let up on the skill and when do we ask students to use this to educate? I think that's a great tension today in the earlier grades. So Whitehead argues, and we've talked about this a bit, that the Romance stage concerns itself with unexplored connections. I talk about Romance as a type of immediate induction. Okay, it's what we see when we watch a toddler exploring his or her world for the first time on their, hands and knees, crawling about the living room for the first time, crawling amongst the objects in a room, some put there for the child, some you would rather the child not play with, putting things in their mouths, playing with stuff. That child is generalizing from those experiences, constantly generalizing and recategorizing and um, relearning their world through that process. This is a child at play. No better way to understand this than to give a child a box. An older child, give them a big box and watch them play with the box in any number of different ways. And this really can establish a kind of conceptual basis of what a lesson should be like. Okay, there should be some aspect of that. Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who's mentioned by Dahl, and I believe, if I remember right, I mentioned him in the Harvey piece, who actually was a teacher for a while, a middle school math teacher, if you will, in the foothills of the Alps in Austria, before he, even after he became a well-known philosopher, he kind of ran away from the world and taught school. Apparently, he was not a teacher you wanted. He was quite a martinet as a teacher, so quite strict, I should say. But he taught with interesting ideas, particularly for someone who was tutored, didn't start school until fairly late in his childhood, partly because his family was extremely wealthy. But he says, and Wittgenstein says, to teach something is not to teach one thing. So when we teach something, it's connected. The things that it's connected with. So Dahl uses Genova's work on Wittgenstein, and particularly her concept coming from Wittgenstein of playing at, playing with, and playing in. So Dahl suggests that this initial stage of romance requires guidance because it establishes the ground. Missed that one. It establishes the ground, the prior knowledge, if you will, the background knowledge for all future learning. It also recognizes Aristotle's concept that all learning moves logically from the known to the unknown. Okay, so that's very important. All learning and all acquisition of knowledge, whether it's school learning or acquiring knowledge in the world, moves logically from the known to the unknown. That's why when we're taught a concept that is very strange, very different, not familiar with, it takes us a while to begin to really grasp what that knowledge is about. Yeah, I have some examples, but I won't go into those right now. One of the difficulties we face as teachers today is that technologies that our students engage in is so titillating, right? It's hard to compete in school. And we've begun trying to bring those technologies, into the classroom. And part of the problem with that is that the students are learning these technologies before the teachers, largely. So this is really in this hyper technological world in which technologies change constantly. This is the first time in the history of education, right, that we don't require a teacher to learn how to do these things. And in fact, teachers as older human beings, a lot of their previously learned knowledge gets in the way. They already have heuristics set up, and it gets in the way of the new technologies, how to learn that. Children who have no heuristics, are able to participate in that. And this is part of what G is talking about in his book on what video games have to teach us about learning and literacy. So really, G is in line with Genova's concept that Dahl really harps on, playing with. Okay. I would argue that all these playing at, playing with, playing in are all play. So Bill Dahl and I kind of disagreed. I took this to task a little bit in my dissertation. And of course, playing with is for Dahl the ultimate. Playing at is better than playing in, is playing within the standard context. But I would argue in the way our curriculums are devised, that if we can if we can get students to play in a concept, that's better than no play at all. Okay, and we may rarely get a chance to have students play with what I would consider true play. Playing in means you're trying to come up with a preset outcome, quote unquote, the test. The playing with is playing with a box, playing it in new ways, according to the way Dahl talks about it. I'm not sure that's what Genova really meant, but that's okay. So, I mean, this is what we're engaged in. Generalization is that final stage. It is the final success. Return, but it's a final success. So I know about it, but now I'm able to take this generalization and convert it back into an exploration. I can romance again. I can begin trying to see these connections in new ways, but with the power of knowledge not experienced by the student in his or her first encounter. So, this is what goes on with that toddler. They experience something for the first time, they generalize, they experience with it again, they generalize, things change, it's new. It's almost new every time, kind of thing. So, because once you generalize, you're now able to focus on relationships that and how that knowledge is interconnected more broadly, to see patterns among the facts studied. And this requires fluency. That is why in math, fluency in basic operation is important in order to do higher math. Okay. If you don't have good fluency in subtracting and adding and multiplication, it's very difficult to do division. Okay. Which requires some playfulness, intuition, if you will, to think of what, how to solve that division problem. Okay. and this is something that using calculators don't help us with, okay? It's hard, using a calculator doesn't allow you to become fluent necessarily and to make basic math your own, okay? And largely Eureka Math, from what I've gathered and questions I've asked when all this was introduced, they don't seem to be very concerned with fluency, okay? And I think that's a mistake. The reason for throwing ideas into various combinations has been to help the students see these relationships, these interconnected patterns, okay? This is related to Dewey's arc reflex, to Harvey's analysis and genesis. These two concepts are very similar. I would suggest that Dewey, well, he never cites the concept of analysis and genesis. Being a student in the late 19th century in New England, engaged in Harvey's exercise, analysis and genesis, okay? In his arc reflex, which is a psychological explanation of analysis and genesis, basically argues that it takes, all learning requires two steps, an analytical step and then the synthesis step. You have to do something with the knowledge. You can't just memorize the knowledge or categorize the knowledge. You have to apply it in some way. In Harvey's world, this application was a written text, right? Right, or speech making of some type, okay? So it's very, so having creative writing projects, having creative projects with math, that it's just not memorizing how to do a formula, is how is this formula useful in either the scientific world, all right, or in the everyday world, okay, would be another aspect of that. And so there should be, if you're doing math, at some point you need to show the scientific connections, because largely the mathematics is a consequence of scientific experimentation, okay? So we use math to explain what we've already discovered scientifically, all right? So it's a post priori logical exercise, mathematics is, okay? And it's historical, all right? Because we did certain things in science before we did other things in science, okay? I think the statement by Whitehead says it all. In The Aims of Education, this is how he ends The Aims of Education. Where attainable knowledge could have changed the issue, ignorance has the guilt of vice. So what issue is being changed? The issue of one's life, right? Where attainable knowledge could have changed the direction of a child's life, improving that life, living a better life, however you want to define better in this case. Not to teach them, okay, leaving them ignorant, okay, has the guilt of vice. If we don't do this, then why have school? Is the big question. And I'll end with, it's not about good teaching, but about good learning, okay? We used to talk about, when I first started education courses, about turning students into independent learners. Well, the high stakes testing has moved that bar. We don't do that anymore. We want them to be good test takers, okay? Because we use the test to show how we as teachers look good and how we as school districts look good, how it keeps the state off our back, so to speak. So it's self-defeating for the student and self-aggrandizing for the schools. This I have an ethical and moral problem with, quite frankly. Teaching should lead to good learning. Teaching should be transparent, although ever present, hovering in the background. Okay. So if you have any questions, please, about this video and about Dahl's work, please email me. Be glad to talk with you about it. I'll be doing a few more of these. I'll see you in the videos. Y'all take care.